the money disappeared. Not slowly, not through careful negotiation or diplomatic channels. $106 billion more than the GDP of most nations simply ceased to exist in the ledgers that matter. China poured a decade of capital into Venezuela, building refineries, funding oil extraction, constructing ports and railways. They believed in contracts. They believed in sovereignty. They believed the oil would flow and the debts would clear. But Xi Jinping now stands before his inner circle using a word that rarely escapes Chinese diplomatic language: theft, not loss, not default. Theft. And he's pointing directly at Washington. You need to understand what this really means. This isn't about Venezuela's collapse or China's overreach. This is about the moment when the world's second largest economy publicly declared that the global financial system, the one you were told was built on rules and lees, actually a weapon. And that weapon just vaporized more money than your country will generate in a century. If it can happen to China, what protection do you think your savings account offers? The story you've been told goes like this. China made risky bets on a failing socialist state. Venezuela mismanaged everything. And Beijing lost money the way investors sometimes do. Bad luck? Poor due diligence? The market punishing foolish lending. That's the narrative served through every financial news outlet, every think tank report, every diplomatic press release. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like capitalism working as intended. But strip away that veneer, and you will find something far darker, a pattern of financial warfare that has been perfected over decades and is now being deployed with surgical precision against anyone who steps outside the dollar system. China didn't just invest in Venezuela. They built an alternative. Every dollar Beijing sent to Caracas was a dollar that didn't flow through New York banks. Every oil barrel shipped to Chinese refineries was one less barrel priced in American currency. Every infrastructure project completed meant Venezuela could sell its resources without asking permission from Washington. This wasn't charity. This was the blueprint for breaking dollar hegemony. China was constructing a parallel financial system, one transaction at a time, one bilateral deal at a time, one sovereign partnership at a time. And the moment that system began to threaten the existing order, it was destroyed. The mechanism was elegant. Sanctions. The word itself sounds administrative, almost boring. But sanctions are siege warfare by another name. When the United States declared Venezuela's government illegitimate and froze its foreign assets, it didn't just hurt Maduro, it severed every contractual obligation Caracas had with Beijing. Chinese state companies couldn't collect on oil shipments because Venezuelan accounts were frozen in international banks. Joint ventures couldn't operate because suppliers refused to risk secondary sanctions. Infrastructure projects ground to a halt because materials couldn't be imported. The loans couldn't be repaid because the revenue streams were choked off. And all of this happened without a single shot fired, without a single soldier deployed, without even a formal declaration of economic war. China watched their investments turn to vapor, not because Venezuela refused to pay, not because the projects failed, but because a third party, one that wasn't even part of the original agreements, simply decided those contracts no longer mattered. Think about that. Two sovereign nations sign binding agreements, capital flows, projects are built. Then a different government on a different continent announces those agreements are void and enforces that decision through control of the global banking system. This is the theft Xi Jinping is talking about, not metaphorical theft. Actual confiscation through financial infrastructure control. You've seen this pattern before, even if you didn't recognize it. Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa before NATO intervention. Gaddafi was building the African gold dinar, a currency that would allow the continent to trade oil without dollars. He had the reserves. He had the regional support. He was months away from launch. Then came the humanitarian intervention, the regime change, the civil war. Libya's gold disappeared. The dinar plan died. Oil sales returned to dollar denomination. The pattern repeated in Iraq, when Saddam Hussein announced oil sales in euros months before invasion. It repeated in Iran when they opened a non-dollar oil bourse and suddenly became an existential nuclear threat. It's repeating now in Russia, where $300 billion in central bank reserves were simply seized not through law, not through courts, but through executive decree. Venezuela represented something more dangerous than any single country's defection. It was the testing ground for a China-led alternative system. If Beijing could make Venezuela work, could keep oil flowing, could maintain infrastructure projects, could prove that bilateral currency arrangements could replace dollar clearing, then dozens of other nations would follow. Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Pakistan, Turkey. Every country tired of watching their foreign policy dictated by access to SWIFT transfers and New York Fed accounts. Venezuela was the proof of concept. That's why it had to fail. That's why $106 billion had to vanish. The Chinese aren't naive. They understand power. They've studied every empire that rose and fell. They know that reserve currency status is the ultimate geopolitical weapon, more valuable than any military base or nuclear arsenal. Control the currency, and you control trade. Control trade, and you control resources. Control resources, and you control survival itself. China spent 20 years building alternatives: the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, bilateral currency swap lines, the digital yuan, every project designed to create economic pathways that bypass American financial infrastructure. And every project now threatened by what happened in Venezuela, because the message is clear. It doesn't matter what contracts you sign, it doesn't matter what international law says, it doesn't matter if you follow every rule in the global trade system. If you threaten dollar dominance, your assets can be frozen, your transactions blocked, your investments nullified. The system will simply declare you illegitimate and proceed as if your legal claims don't exist. And every bank, every clearinghouse, every shipping company, every insurance provider will comply because the alternative is losing access to the dollar system themselves. This is where your life enters the story. You think this is about geopolitics? Do you think this is about great powers fighting over global influence? But the same mechanism that vaporized China's Venezuelan investments is already targeting your future. Your government borrows money it will never repay. Your central bank prints currency to buy that debt. Your savings lose purchasing power year after year. And when you object, when you try to protect yourself, when you move assets into anything outside the controlled system, you're told that's risky, that's speculation, that's financially irresponsible. The theft isn't just happening in Caracas. It's happening in your retirement account. Every time interest rates are held below inflation, you're being taxed without legislation. Every time currency is devalued through monetary expansion, your stored labor is confiscated. Every time assets you're told are safe bonds, pension funds, bank deposits lose real value, you're experiencing the same thing China experienced in Venezuela. The difference is scale and speed. They lost billions overnight through sanctions. You're losing thousands slowly through policy. But the mechanism is identical. Contracts don't matter. Rules don't matter. What matters is proximity to the system's control center. You were raised to believe in property rights, in rule of law, in the sanctity of contracts. You were told that if you saved, if you invested wisely, if you followed the rules, your future was secure. But China followed the rules. They signed contracts. They built real infrastructure. They invested in productive assets. And they watched it all disappear because someone else controlled the financial rails. Your pension fund manager follows the rules. Your bank follows the rules. Your brokerage account follows the rules. But when the system decides those rules need to change, when inflation needs to run hotter, when debt needs to be monetized, when currency needs to be devalued, your compliance won't protect you. The Venezuelan collapse wasn't an accident. It wasn't mismanagement. It was engineered. The same way every previous challenge to dollar hegemony was engineered. The same way every attempt to create alternative financial infrastructure has been crushed. Libya, Iraq, Iran, Russia, Venezuela. Each one presented as a unique case. A rogue regime, a humanitarian crisis, a threat to global stability. Each one destroyed through the same financial mechanisms. Each one serving as a warning to everyone else, considering an exit from the system. China got the message. Watch what they're doing now. Stockpiling gold at rates never seen before. Building bilateral trade agreements that settle in yuan or local currency. Accelerating the digital yuan rollout. Reducing treasury holdings. Diversifying reserves away from dollar assets. These aren't random policy choices. This is a nation preparing for financial war. They know the next phase is coming. They know that as the dollar system becomes more fragile, it will become more aggressive. They know that threats will escalate to preserve the existing order, and they're building walls. But you can't build walls. You don't have a sovereign wealth fund or a central bank. You can't negotiate bilateral currency swaps or stockpile strategic resources. You're trapped inside the system with no diplomatic immunity, no geopolitical leverage, no institutional defenses. When your currency is devalued, you absorb the loss. When your assets are inflated and then crashed, you bear the volatility. When the rules change, you adapt or you perish. This is the reality that Xi Jinping just stated publicly. The system is not neutral. The rules are not universal. And when pressure comes, the theft won't announce itself. It will simply show up in your account balance, your purchasing power, your vanished retirement security. The timing matters. This is happening now because the system is breaking. Federal debt is accelerating beyond any possibility of repayment. Interest payments are consuming budget allocation once reserved for everything else. Money printing is the only option left, but money printing destroys the currency's credibility, and credibility is the only thing backing a fiat system. When the world's reserve currency is dying, those controlling it don't surrender peacefully, they squeeze harder. They weaponize access. They make examples of anyone building alternatives. Venezuela was an example. Russia is an example. China is being warned. And your collateral? You want to believe there's a plan? The policymakers know what they're doing, but the adults are in charge, and the system is fundamentally stable. But the adults in charge just made the world's second largest economy publicly accuse them of theft. The adults in charge have been running deficits for decades with no path to balance. The adults in charge have painted themselves into a corner where the only options are default or inflation, and both end the same way. Your savings don't survive either scenario. This is why the money disappeared. Not because of incompetence, not because of bad bets, but because maintaining control of the system requires destroying alternatives. Every time, without exception. History is screaming this pattern at you, but you've been taught to see each incident as isolated, each crisis as unique, each collapse as someone else's problem. It's the same story repeating in different costumes. The actors change, but the script remains identical. And now the question becomes, what happens when China stops playing by rules they know are rigged? What happens when the second largest economy openly acknowledges the game is theft and starts building systems that do ask permission? What happens when dozens of nations decide that losing investments to sanctions is less dangerous than remaining dependent on a currency system controlled by someone else? What happens when the dollar's monopoly breaks? Not through military defeat, but through coordinated abandonment. You're living through the answer right now. Currency volatility. Inflation surging, then cooling, then surging again. Interest rates swinging wildly. Asset prices disconnected from fundamentals. Pension funds requiring bailouts. Banks failing despite regulatory oversight. Each crisis labeled isolated. Each solution involving more intervention, more control, more concentration of power in the same institutions that created the problem. In each cycle transferring more wealth from those outside the system's inner circle to those inside it. China just told you, the game is theft. They said it in diplomatic language, through official channels, in a way that lets you dismiss it as propaganda, but dismiss it and you miss the warning. Dismiss it and you keep trusting the same contracts, the same institutions, the same promises that just vaporized $106 billion of sovereign investment. The theft isn't coming. The theft is operational. It's been operational for decades. You're just now seeing it scaled up to targets that can't be ignored. The collapse isn't a future event you can prepare for with a checklist and a survival kit. The collapse is the system eating itself while telling you everything is fine, everything is managed, everything is under control. And the moment you realize that the controls themselves are the weapon that sanctions and freezes, and rules and regulations are how wealth is transferred from the non-compliant to the compliant, you'll understand why Xi Jinping chose that specific word, theft, because that's exactly what it is. The only question left is whether you'll see it before it reaches your accounts, or whether you will wake up one morning to discover that your life savings have become another line item in someone else's geopolitical victory.